Unit 1, Cognitive Psychology. Presentation 7, Eyewitness Testimony, the Cognitive Interview.
Although much of the research on eyewitness testimony has highlighted the problems with such recall, researchers also looked at techniques to improve the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. The cognitive interview is one such technique. It is a procedure designed to improve the effectiveness of police interviews when questioning witnesses to a crime.
What's involved in the cognitive interview?
The first thing to say about the cognitive interview is that it has the advantage of involving the use of a variety of different retrieval strategies. In contrast, the standard interview that is usually used by policemen involves asking straightforward simple questions, such as, what was she wearing, what time was it, and so on. The second point to make is that the cognitive interview is grounded in proven psychological research on memory, so it ought to be more effective than the so-called standard interview.
There are 4 main components to the cognitive interview. The first component is to report everything. This means an eyewitness should be encouraged to include every single detail they can remember about the event, even though it might seem irrelevant.
This is important because often witnesses won't bother to mention information they believe is irrelevant. It's also important because the more things remembered, the more triggers there are for other memories. Memories are interrelated, so the more details that are retrieved, the more likely that other memories will be cued.
The second component is mental reinstatement of the original context. The police interviewer should help the eyewitness mentally recreate the environment from the original incident.
This is valuable because research has shown that context is an important cue for memory. For example, one study by Alan Baddeley found that underwater divers who had memorised word lists when they were diving later recalled these word lists better when they were underwater again rather than on land. So the context of being underwater acted as a cue.
The third component is changing the order. For example, reversing the order in which events occurred, or starting in the middle when trying to recall events.
The value of this strategy is that our memories are affected by expectations. We have scripts for particular situations, and these predetermine what we recall. For example, we have a script for what a familiar bus journey is like. So if you were asked to recall a particular bus journey, this script is going to influence how you recall events, leading to inaccuracies in your recall.
The fourth component is changing the perspective. The interviewer is trying to access a person's memory from a different viewing point. The witness is, for example, asked to imagine how the scene might have appeared to other witnesses present at the time, or how the scene might have appeared if they were a policeman instead of a bank cashier.
For example, in one study by Anderson and Pitchert, participants were given a story about 2 boys playing in a house and later asked to recall details of what the house was like. People remembered different details depending on whether they were told to imagine they were a potential house buyer or imagine they were a burglar. Perspective matters.
Finally, it is worth mentioning a final 5th component. This component is part of the enhanced cognitive interview and concerns creating a bond between the interviewer and the eyewitness. This bond involves building up a relationship with the eyewitness and establishing trust and confidence. Research suggests that the resulting sense of rapport between interviewer and witness will bring about better recall.
Evaluating the cognitive interview. One obvious way to assess the effectiveness of the cognitive interview is to compare it to the standard police interview. Konken and colleagues looked at the findings from 53 studies and did just this. They found that overall there was a 34% increase in the amount of correct information recalled using cognitive interview techniques in comparison to the use of the standard interview.
Just to remind you, a standard interview is one where the interviewer just asks a set of simple, straightforward questions.
However, the downside of using the cognitive interview was that they also found an increase in the amount of incorrect information recalled. If we take this inaccurate recall into account when calculating an overall figure, then both kinds of interview produce similar accuracy results of about 80%, which is disappointing.
One of the criticisms of this meta-analysis is that most of the studies were lab-based and involved mainly college students, which challenges the validity of the conclusions. There haven't been many attempts to study the effectiveness of the cognitive interview technique outside the lab, but one, in Brazil, gave some support for the technique. In this study, Stein and Memon recruited female cleaning staff to watch a video of a crime. Afterwards, some participants were interviewed using standard techniques, whereas others were interviewed using cognitive methods. The latter produced better recall, especially for information that would be useful, such as a detailed description of a man holding a gun.
Another way of assessing the effectiveness of the cognitive interview is to consider the separate elements to see which ones might be most effective in enhancing recall. Milne and Bull conducted a lab experiment using college students and children. Each participant was interviewed using just one of the components, or was simply instructed to try again. They found that none of the individual components produced any more accurate information than the standard technique. However, when they combined certain elements, they found that report everything and mental reinstatement produced significantly higher recall than when just one of the elements was used.
So, the research seems to indicate that the cognitive interview does not appear to be much more effective than the standard interview. Why is this?
One possible reason might be that people using the techniques, even policemen and women, haven't been sufficiently trained, and therefore the techniques are not being used effectively. Another reason is that in lab studies, people are not sufficiently motivated to recall everything they can, which could explain the disappointing results.
A final evaluation issue is the question of why the cognitive interview is not being used extensively in the UK if it has the potential to improve eyewitness recall. A survey by Clark and Milne in 2001 found that only 17% of interviews carried out by police forces in England and Wales were using cognitive techniques.
The main problem appears to be time. According to Kebbel and Wagstaff, the cognitive interview is not seen as cost-effective because it takes a lot of time and officers don't feel they have that time to spend on an extended interview. Amina Memon reported that detectives only received very brief training in the use of cognitive methods, probably only about 4 hours. This is not likely to be enough to lead to improved results, and therefore police remain unconvinced about using the cognitive interview.
What can we conclude? The cognitive interview is based on solid psychological evidence and should be beneficial in increasing the accuracy of eyewitness recall. However, the barriers to using it in practice seem to limit its effectiveness.